Good point. Are they aiming towards Kiev? Because you're right, they are very close. Like this is when they in their military objectives, they seem to be going in a particular direction. Is that direction ultimately Kiev? Is it
It's
take the
so
capital?
hard. It's so hard to say. If you'll remember last year, we were talking about the same thing,
Yeah.
right? Around the same time, right? And part of the strategy, right, of this conflict, of getting over the problems of 24/7 satellite and drone reconnaissance, right? Of the very difficult, how almost impossible it is for strategic level surprise, right? It's very difficult even for tactical level surprise, right? So how do you resolve that, right? You keep your forces fluid, right? You have to rely on the maneuverability of the forces, of the strength of your logistics arm, such that you can move your forces along that contact line and apply them at a last moment, at a place, at a time and opportunity that may arise very quickly. Maybe the Kiev regime shuffles forces from here to there, and that makes their position here weakly. You have to be ready then, like water surging towards that area, to surge forces there. And maybe that's where you're offensive. Maybe you have 5 plans for offensives and you're going to use 2 of them, right?
Mhm.
The others, will be dictated by the last minute calculations on the battlefield of where things are. And one of those plans may be advancing towards Kiev. Does that mean that they're definitely going to do that? Maybe the Kiev regime then gets freaked out and starts moving what reserves it has to there, and then that looks less attractive, right? And then you go for somewhere else. That's why it is very hard to make predictions,
I
right?
see.
About where. To me, right? Go for the head, right?
Take the capital.
Screw these negotiations, right? Settle things, right? That is it may be more difficult than in terms of casualties than a grinding war of attrition, with artillery and drones in the Donbass, right? If you send big armored forces trundling to Kiev and have to keep up those logistics lines and everything, yes, you're going to suffer more casualties. There's no question about that in the short term. But if you take Kiev, there is at least the possibility of forcing a settlement on Russia's terms then, right? I mean, there wouldn't be any possibility of claiming, oh, it's a stalemate, right? I mean, that false narrative would not be sustainable under conditions of Russian troops in Kiev, right? That would, right? So that would be what I would do. But I don't have the intelligence, the C4S, ISR, the intimate knowledge that Putin does. We're just armchairing, right? We're armchairing him. So I certainly think it's a possibility. I think considering Russia is under some pressure by Putin demanding, or by Trump demanding a settlement yesterday, right? I mean, he's trying to puts a degree of time pressure, right? Because Russia would prefer a settlement that at least makes some extent towards normalizing relations, if not with the West as a whole, then at least with the US, even if that window is only a few years while Trump is in power, right?
Mm-hmm.
They would prefer a diplomatic end, whatever that end is, rather than a seething, frozen conflict, right? Like what happened in Syria, right? Because the U.S. and Russia never came to a police settlement over Syria, right? And Russia and Iran came to a kind of frozen conflict agreement, with fingers behind the back with Erdogan. And we saw where that ended. Russia would prefer, right? One of their key demands is not just that Russia has Lugansk and Donetsk and Kherson and Zaporozhye and Crimea, but they recognize under international law that it's ours, right? And that's a huge demand. That's very hard, even for Trump not caring about Ukraine to give up, right? That would be read as, that would be the top headline of every paper and TV headline in the U.S. would be Trump surrenders Ukraine to Putin, to Soviet Union resurgent, all of this type of nonsense that will be floated out, and so that's why it's so difficult, right? But on the other hand, he doesn't have many options on the table, right? And it's either surrender things diplomatically or surrender them militarily. Again, the only other option is it's Biden's mess. I'm out of here. I tried my best. Right now, I'm going to go back to trying to fuck up the global economy and waging war on Iran or China or whoever else. Right? But this is everywhere now. The Trump administration is every which way they turn. They are confronted with Russia, China, and Iran that are together, right? If he reaches out to the Middle East, he's bumping up against Iran. If he reaches to the other side across Europe, he's bumping into Russia. If he reaches across the Pacific, he's bumping into China, right? These are, once again, three conflicts, right, that could get hot or hotter in the blink of an eye. And everywhere it's Russia and China and Iran standing together. And just last meet, before these Oman negotiations began, Russian and Chinese representatives were meeting with the Iranian government, setting plans, right, for those Oman negotiations. Where they go from there, they are coming to a consensus. And I think probably most of your listeners out there now are aware of this video of Joe Biden, then on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee in the 1990s, laughing and talking about shoving NATO expansion down Russia's throat, right? And then complaining about it and saying, well, we might have to, look to China. And Biden was laughing. Ha ha, look to China. We're the only game in town. You go ahead and try that. What are you going to do? Look to Iran next? Ha ha ha.
And they did. And
they did. And Joe Biden was buried, smashing up against that rock of Russian, Chinese, and Iranian. You don't want to say alliance, that's fine. Partnership, whatever word you want to use to describe it. But Joe Biden smashed up against it. He surged around the Middle East, didn't like what he saw there, tried to avoid it there. However, how much Netanyahu wanted it, he wanted to pivot to China, but he got smashed, thinking he could seize a victory against Russia in Ukraine and then go somewhere else. And he smashed against it. Now Biden is left surging around those three rocks again, right? And every one of them is a bad option, right? The good option would be for the U.S. to concentrate on Trump's own internal political war against the deep state, reform in the United States, finding a useful place for itself in a multipolar world order. But that's impossible. That's impossible for the U.S. It's impossible for Trump, whom has obviously, he has charted a course towards his vision. He has arrived at the conclusion that the pursuit of U.S.-led Western global hegemony and primacy is too expensive for the U.S., right? And we had this statement, right, that was released on the White House website, right, on the official U.S. White House website, but talks about the tariffs by Trump's economic advisor from the Council of Economic Policy Advisors, Steve Mirren. And this piece, he says that part of the rationale for the tariffs war is to pay for what the Trump administration, that's their mentality. They consider global public goods. And those global public goods are the US global military, right? It's hundreds of thousand plus military bases, its forces, and the right for the rest of the world to use the dollar as the global reserve currency, which the US, Trump himself is saying, if BRICS tries to create their own currency, I'll crush them, right? So this is the mafia ticket. And the tariffs, it's not that the Trump administration recognizing that U.S. hegemony is too expensive. They want to have it both ways. They want to pursue a great power imperial strategy, but they're not willing to give up the pursuit of hegemony and primacy in either its military facet or its economic financial facet. And their rationale is that's what the tariffs are for, is to make the rest of the world pay for U.S. global military primacy and to maintain the U.S.'s ability to rack up a $37 trillion national deficit, right, with complete
Mark, this is silly. I'm sorry, this is silly.
That's where it's on the White House website. That is Trump's own economic advisor explaining the rationale. This is the hubris of the people it's not completely different, of course, from the hubris of the Biden administration. It's just with a different veneer. But it's
so incompetent. Like, if you think about it, like, for example, the Republicans are about to pass a massive tax cut on top of all of this. We are paying for the tariffs. So it's not like other countries are paying for it. The American public is paying for it.
You're paying for it, not me.
Yeah, we're paying for it. Well, right. I mean, but we are effectively paying for those tariffs while whatever money that they get are going to give a tax cut to the top 1% on top of that. And to make it even worse, it's even worse than that, because you have companies that are basically folding, closing up here in the US as a result, meaning layoffs. It is most likely going to cause a recession, if not stagflation, because now you're going to...
Did you hear the CEO of Amazon sounding the alarm?
No,
70%, he said 70% of Amazon's stock is sourced in China.
Wow.
70%. Right? The biggest distributor in the United States.
What do you think? There's an argument to be made that the motivation for these tariffs is to decouple the United States from China. Because when you had the situation of, let's say, for example, I'm trying to give an example. I can't think of an example. But to effectively say, okay, we don't want our economy to be tethered to China just in case we need to have some kind of war with China, considering we're going into the Pacific and we're going to have a conflict in this way, in the way that that's what it is. The European economy was tethered to the Russian economy. So the moment that Europe says, okay, we're not using Russian gas, Europe fell apart. You had all of these businesses closing up, the amenities businesses moving into the United States, energy bills went through the roof. Europe took a direct hit as a result of their attempted decoupling from Russia. The US is looking at this saying, if we indeed move into the Pacific and we want to keep China in the barn, I think that horse is already out the barn at this point, whatever, then we need to decouple from China. And the way that we decouple from China is to effectively damage our own economy now with the notion that we may be able to build these industries up in a later conflict. Give me a take on that. I mean, there's a continuity of US policy, regardless of the president. So I don't necessarily put it to the side, but the tariff war has been so extreme and outlandish that part of me thinks that could be true.
Yeah, that's part of it. And that is a continuum of hegemony. If you'll remember, the Biden administration was trying to force the Europeans to stop trade with China, trying to give them up on electric vehicles, on this, on that, right? So that is a continuity of agenda, right? From administration, to administration, since Obama with the pivot to China, the pivot to Asia, right? Yeah. That has been a continuity of agenda. The U.S. has just never managed it because they've always gotten distracted in the Middle East or with Russia. right? No administration has managed it so far. They've never quite gotten to that conflict with China, which is probably for their own good, because if they can't handle Russia in Ukraine, then they're certainly not going to handle China in the Taiwanese Straits and the South China Sea. But, regardless, here's the problem. That is part of it, right? But the scattershot and rollbacks that we have seen in this tariff policy, right? So first, tariffs on Canada and Mexico. And, no tariffs on Canada and Mexico. Oh, yes, tariffs on Canada and Mexico. Tariffs for everyone. Tariffs for the whole world. 10% tariffs, 70% tariffs for you. Tariffs, China, you get some extra tariffs. Oh, the bond market doesn't like that. Oh, a pause on the tariffs for everyone but China. You're fighting back, more tariffs for you. But quietly, we're going to reduce the tariffs on China regarding cell phones and semiconductor chips, smartphones, and other things, because our consumers still want them. This is not a coherent policy. This is, I want tariffs. Give me a policy and make it work. And as it's being rolled out, they're in and out, forward and back, again and again and again. This is not, there is arguments made in support of this by different people. And one of those almost certainly is the process, which is going to be a multi-administration process, as we saw, it began in the Biden era, of decoupling economically with China to the largest extent possible. Here's one of the problems with that, though. Politico did an article, it's already about 2 weeks old. Trump's tariffs threaten U.S. weapon production. Because so much of U.S. supply chains, not just the consumer goods, but everything that goes into even U.S. weapon production, is currently outsourced to the rest of the world, including in China. This is problems that the Trump administration has not thought about in rolling out this war of tariffs with China. It wants a war in the Pacific, but it gets parts from its military from China and other countries in the Pacific. Right. And they're having a hard enough problem ramping up military production in the United States the way things are. And this is going completely under the radar, that these tariffs are also hurting the Pentagon, at least in the short to medium term. You can make the argument in the long term, the Pentagon needs to do this. They need to renationalize their own production and supply chains. Yes, but that's not something that you do overnight with 70% tariffs for the world, right? That is something that is done quiet. This is what Russia has done since 2014, right? They prepared quietly for 8 years for the conflict by making sure all of the supply chains for their military industrial complex, that there was the surge capacity there, that they could get all of the chemical precursors for explosives and everything that they needed all the way down the supply chain line of everything that they needed. They planned it out. The Trump administration does not have a plan. They have a vision. Trump's vision, unfortunately, changes every 15 minutes with whoever he was talking to left. Not totally, but to a large degree. There are certain things, right? He loves tariffs, right? We've known that since the 1980s, right? That Trump loves tariffs. He was arguing for it in articles, in editorials back in those days, right? Trump reminds me of an undergraduate student who has read one really in-depth, fascinating, worldview changing book, and that's it. And that book was on William McKinley, right? I mean, and Trump has fixed it. I'm perfectly willing to believe that Trump knows more about William McKinley than I do.
Yeah.
But he has fixated on William McKinley as the golden era, as these tariffs, of even the geopolitical strategies that William McKinley pursued as, that's what he needs to bring back. That's the president that he wants to be. And that's all well and good until you read the in-depth, histories and biographies of all the other presidents, right? And realize that that's just a snapshot of history, and what was appropriate at the end of the 19th century does not necessarily make the most appropriate thing for today. That's what Trump reminds me of.
Yeah, I agree with you. I mean, the tariff thing is, look, if he did this 5 years after globalization started, okay, fair enough. If he was trying to maintain American businesses here in the United States, okay, that makes sense. If he said, okay, I'm going to protect certain industries, and you have them targeted and very specific, okay, good, fair enough. 70% tariffs on like Vietnam is absurd. And to do this across the entire world, and to do this in a way that is disconnected from, let's say, any kind of trade imbalance with the various countries. He said they were going on instinct. And it's like, what? You are having a trade war against the world on instinct?
Oh, okay. He didn't really want it. It was just the negotiation tactic. That's the line that they're pulling out to, I guess it'll satisfy the Trump fanboys, right? Who will reach and grasp at anything to, like a drowning man reaching for a lifesaver to, continue their, Trump knows what he's doing. It's Trump's 5D chess, right? That kind of logic. No, it's not. He rolled it out. It wasn't properly thought through, and they panicked when they saw the bond market crash, right?
Yeah, and China,
of course, they're going to try and spin it as, this is what we were planning all along, right?
Well, and China told them F off. They weren't negotiating. I'm curious about this Russian hit on Sumy. Apparently, there was a large missile strike that took out. There was a Ukrainian ceremony or something. Once again, this happened once before somewhere else. I forget exactly where this happened once before. But a ceremony that was apparently taking place, I believe it was in Sumy, and it got a hit that killed many of the people, or the, let's say, soldiers that were effectively there at that ceremony. Am I getting that right?
Yep. There was, some confusion over the news with some claims being presented, even from some Ukrainian side, that it wasn't a missile strike, that it was some type of depot fire. So no, it was a Russian ministry has come out and admitted the Kiev regime was having an award ceremony, right? This was on a, shall we say, local level. Almost certainly these were troops who fought in Kursk, right? Who fought on Russian territory, who managed to escape and were being rewarded for it. And Russia found out about this meeting, right? A lot of troops, a lot of officers gathered in one place, and within easy range of Russia's ballistic missiles like the Iskander, and they tapped it hard, right? And once again, I think we talked about this last week. There were doubtless some civilian casualties involved in this, right? A public event, you got families of soldiers who might be there, right? You've got some locals. And as always with such things, like when the U.S., attacks other countries like Yemen, when it's bombing Yemen right now, they make a cost-benefit analysis of how many of the proportionality of how many civilians they're putting at risk for going after and what the value of the target is. And Russia has made that calculation, and they hit this ceremony. And
have they expanded their aperture in regards to the number of civilians they're willing to accept?
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. I'm saying that they are, from the beginning of this conflict, it has been a long, slow, painful procedure for Putin to pull the kids' gloves off, right? He certainly didn't do it right away. He's been moving it bit by bit by bit, but we have seen, Russia's threshold for civilian casualties, I think, increase I would say within the last few months to a noticeable degree. Whereas repeatedly, I have to bring up, yes, there were civilian casualties. You may not agree with that, right? You can make that. They made this analysis, right? They're not hitting residential buildings like the Kiev regime does, right? Specifically targeting, civilians for, as a political terror device, right? But the threshold, the number of civilian casualties that Russia is willing to risk, yeah, I think they're demonstrably increasing that as their frustration with the regime in Kiev grows, right? Their inability to acknowledge Russia's victories, and ultimately, Russia is going to have to prove it on the battlefield until the regime in Kiev and the West accepts it, because they still don't accept it. They don't accept it, how badly they're losing. They don't accept that ultimately this war is lost. And until Russia brings that home to them to the level that they can no longer deny it, even to themselves, then the war will continue, and it will continue to be escalated. And Russia has the room to escalate it, and that's what they're doing in multiple facets, whether we're talking, strike thresholds, right? Or whether we're talking new offensives into new regions like Sumy and Chernigov and Dnipropetrovsk. It's all coming. It's Russia is not pausing. They're not hesitating. They're not giving any concessions. They're escalating right now.
Mark, I always appreciate talking to you, man. Mark Sleboda, International Relations Security Analyst. You can find Mark on Twitter at @MarkSleboda1. You can also find him on Facebook, facebook.com/GramG. And you can find him on his channel at Realpolitik with Mark Sleboda. My man, thank you for this, Mark. I really appreciate it. Always appreciate talking to you.
Thanks for having me.
You have a good one. Be safe.